David Greenberg, one of our speakers this evening, is an associate professor of history and journalism, or associate professor of history and of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University, and a frequent commentator in the national news media on contemporary politics and public affairs. He specializes in American political and cultural history. He was formerly a full-time journalist. He is now a contributing editor to Politico magazine, where he writes a regular column. He has also been a regular contributor to Slate magazine since its founding, and has written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and many other scholarly and popular publications. Robin Young, who will be conducting the interview, is the co-host of Here and Now on WBUR and NPR. She is a Peabody Award-winning documentary filmmaker who has also reported for NBC, CBS, and ABC television, and for several years was the substitute host and correspondent for The Today Show. She, like me, is also a Cambridge resident, so I think it's an extra bonus. She has received several Emory Awards for her television work, as well as cable's ACE Award and a radio's regional Edward R. Murrow Award. This evening, they'll be discussing Professor Greenberg's new book, A Republic of Spin, an Inside History of the American Presidency, which examines the rise of the White House spin machine from the progressive era to the present day. So without further ado, I'll turn it over.
Hi, everybody. David, I wanted to be here anyway because just to be in this glorious space, and then this book is just extraordinary. And of course, there's nothing going on in the political sphere, is there? I barely made it here today. Please, nobody announce anything more. Although I think Donald Trump this afternoon announced there will be riots if he is not the nominee. So.
And probably if he is, too.
I know, I barely got out the door. And it's obvious that I will do anything, to sort of distract myself from this election, including reading this big a book. It is just huge, but it's just got every page is filled with so much. So we'll try to hit on as much as we can. But you had me early on at Mark Twain saying that Teddy Roosevelt was a juvenile showboating ham. I just love that. Let's start with Teddy Roosevelt, because you say he can claim to be the first president of the modern age with the first public presidency, making courting public opinion central to the job. Why?
Right. So I want to explain first, people sometimes say, well, why start with Theodore Roosevelt? Isn't spin, doesn't go back farther than that? And of course it does. I mean, I suggest in the book, spin is as old as politics. Spin, in some form, is inherently part of politics.
Well, I was reading Michael Beschloss's review of the book, and he points out that Lincoln allowed himself to be sort of described as a log-splitting farm boy when he was a lawyer.
Right, exactly. And William Henry Harrison in 1840 gave us, the hard cider, log cabin and hard cider campaign, and he was, kind of this aristocratic figure who was just trying to keep up with the Democrats as the party of Andrew Jackson. So it's not that spin and image making is new. What's new with Theodore Roosevelt is the American presidency becomes oriented toward winning public opinion. You look at the 19th century presidents, and by and large, Jackson, Lincoln, a few exceptions noted, they're not names we remember because they didn't see it as their purpose to set an agenda from the White House. Reporters, if you were a member of the Washington Press Corps, and there wasn't much of one, but you covered Congress. That's where the press galleries was. There was no White House press room. So this is really what starts to change in a significant way with Teddy Roosevelt. Coming after the Industrial Revolution with all this social and economic inequality and need for reform, Roosevelt sees it as his purpose as president to drive the agenda. To drive the agenda, he has to win public opinion. And to win public opinion, he has to develop the machinery of what I'm calling spin.
Well, even before the presidency, I was reading the portion where he's getting all the press to follow him with the Rough Riders and the battle in Cuba and taking a hill, and the word Photoshop came to mind. I think he's the first person to Photoshop himself into a scene.
Right. I mean, yeah, there are these sort of phony newsreels that are shown in theaters that, they're shot on a Manhattan rooftop that sort of purport to be...
Raising a flag in Cuba.
Of the heroics from Cuba. But, absolutely, Teddy Roosevelt had a kind of intuitive instinct for the spotlight, and he chose, he knew how to avail himself of the new technology of newsreels, of the newly powerful mass circulation newspapers. So he went about courting reporters and getting stories written the way he wanted. Yeah, and he did this when he was police commissioner of New York. He did this when he was going off to Cuba to fight in the Spanish-American War. He did this as governor. So when he came into the presidency, he was all ready. He was ready from day one.
Well, he worked with Upton Sinclair, who had exposed the meatpacking horrors in the jungle. But as I look at all the names, and we're going to go over some of the lists of the names of the people behind the presidents that were part of this publicity machine, I did not know George Cortelyou.
Yeah.
Tell us who he was.
Right. I mean, my brother-in-law, when I was telling him about this book, he said, so you should call this book A Lot of Cool People I've Never Heard of. There are all of these forgotten spin doctors. I mean, many of us remember, Michael Deaver or, from the Reagan era, the more recent ones, and we think, oh, this is a relatively new breed, but they do go all the way back. George Cortelyou was an assistant stenographer to the Postmaster General who came over in the Cleveland White House to the White House when they needed another White House clerk. At the time, the White House staff was just a handful of people, and these clerks were just kind of all-purpose assistants. Cortelyou sort of works his way up, so by the time of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, he is the White House secretary, which is kind of chief of staff, press secretary, scheduler, all these positions, speechwriter to some degree, all rolled into one. And Cortelyou is a kind of exemplar of the progressive era ideal of efficiency. He makes sure that all the press requests get handled in a systematic way. He makes sure that press coverage is clipped and put in scrapbooks and digested for the president to know what's being said about him. He sort of helps put Roosevelt's effort to communicate with the public at large into a kind of orderly, systematic fashion. By the end of the presidency, Roosevelt thinks so highly of him, he makes him Treasury Secretary, head of the Republican Committee. He almost is the nominee to run on the Republican ticket in 1908. Instead, Roosevelt picks William Howard Taft, who becomes president. But Cortelyou, is this close to being, a presidential nominee and perhaps president. So, and instead, instead of having biographies written about him, he's got a chapter in my book.
Well, and a real role in history. But at the time, talk about the words that were used, because at the time, right now, we look at this through the prism of today, and already aren't you starting to feel a little unclean, like there was somebody who was helping TR get his message out? Doesn't that feel bad? But it didn't then. They called it publicity, but publicity did not mean what we think it means.
Right. So the term publicity, which Roosevelt openly embraced, meant making the private public, and we still sort of use it in that way. So publicity, Louis Brandeis also used it. We know the phrase sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? This is the idea that whether it's exposing big business, bringing its private dealings to light, or in politics, the closed door dealings, exposing them to the light of day will bring about reform. And Roosevelt figured publicity, if I sort of make known what I'm doing to the public at large, this is what's going to galvanize the public to support these reforms. And of course, it's not unrelated to publicity in the sense of self-serving publicity, grandstanding for the spotlight, because drawing attention to his programs also meant drawing attention to himself. And so the two meanings start to get blurred, and it's really by the end of the progressive era that this later usage of publicity in the sense of public relations, propaganda, as it was also called, really comes to dominate.
Well, there's a whole page here that's great, but I did read it, the whole book. You can see I highlighted this whole page because it was so good about word usage, because public relations started off as a more upstanding word, and then it became kind of seedy, and propaganda, which I didn't know started as a Catholic Church word.
propagating the faith.
But it had a neutral meaning for a long time. It didn't have the negative meaning. But then you go on, the Cold War brought news management, then we got psychological warfare, that became public diplomacy. Then you had, with television, selling, advertising, packaging, marketing. Then you had messaging, branding, framing, strategic communications. And you land on philosopher Harry Frankfurt, who landed on, I'll have to bleep this, bullshit.
Right.
So the word, and then spin, which, when did spin start being used?
Well, spin really comes into wide usage in the 1980s. It comes out of the presidential debates where, after the debates, the candidates have their surrogates who are out there writing, mouthing lines that they wrote probably before the debate about why their guy won. And there are enough of them that they are in what's called spin alley, and then there are so many they need the spin room. It gets upgraded. And I think, the reason I like the term spin is because when we see these spin doctors, as they were called, now we sometimes say spinmeisters, spinners, we know, the reporters interviewing them know that what they're saying isn't sincere, and the audience watching the reporters interview the spin doctors also know, so we're sort of all in on the game, and yet we watch anyway. We watch because we're confident we can see through it sometimes. We can criticize it, but we can also appreciate it if it's done in the service of a candidate that we're rooting for or a cause or an argument that we support. So if you take an earlier word like propaganda, which implies sort of the heavy hand of the state sort of forcing messages upon us, spin has, a more lighthearted feel. It suggests, no, this is a process in which the audience is involved and implicated, and we are not just sort of passive in the face of these messages that are thrown at us, but we're able to decode them and challenge them. Yeah,
We're all in on it.
we're all in on it.
Well, I want to talk more about the different steps along the way to where we are today. But how do Plato and Aristotle make their way in here?
Right. Well, I spent one summer reading a lot of Greek philosophy in the Columbia University Library because I was trying to understand, the roots of this. And they didn't talk about spin, but they talked about rhetoric, which was the equivalent. And you really see two starkly different attitudes. Plato, who is the idealist, thinks all rhetoric is bad, to be deplored, because even if it is being used for something that's truthful, the purpose of the rhetoric isn't to get you to truth. The purpose of rhetoric is just to induce conviction. So rhetoric to him is a debased form of philosophy. Philosophy is what gets you to the truth. Aristotle, who is more descriptive than prescriptive, says no, rhetoric can be used for good or for ill, depending on the speaker, the purpose for which it's being put. And as I finished this book, I came to the conclusion that today we have a certain ambivalent attitude towards spin. On the surface, we think of ourselves as Platonists, deploring the spin and these consultants and speechwriters and pollsters and kind of thinking it's all corrupting our politics. But deep down, we're really Aristotelians, maybe even unwittingly, and that when, Obama or a candidate you like or a president you like isn't spinning well, you wish he were doing it better. And we actually think that spin is effective when and good when it's being put to the purpose of a positive cause. So there's that tension in our attitude between the Platonic and the Aristotelian positions.
Yeah. Well, as I said, there's so much. We just touched on Roosevelt, and then the first one. But if you could, there's so many incredible names that just jump off the page at you. Walter Lippmann, the great newsman, but also became part of the government when he had to, as many people did, Hannah Arendt, Vance Packard. You made me go and get my copy of Vance Packard's book, The Hidden Persuaders, how we're manipulated by advertising. But then you also have Edward Bernays, how he manipulated us. So if you could just from Roosevelt, just if you could skip like a stone a little bit through, I know the whole book, but
Right.
if you could skip up to, maybe even the 50s, and how, with the development of technology and radio and broadcasting, how different people along the way burnished spin.
Right. So one way of thinking about it, to give people a sense of the book, there is the story of these presidents. That's kind of the first strand of the narrative, from Theodore Roosevelt to Woodrow Wilson, who sets up the first wartime propaganda agency called the Committee on Public Information during World War I, through the presidents of the 1920s, who used what was then called ballyhoo, photo ops, speechwriters, public relations stunts, and so on, all the way up to Obama with his use of a first White House videographer and the first White House Twitter feed. Then I have a second strand of people like Bernays, people like Cortelyou, and a lot of, some you've heard of, some you haven't, who assisted the presidents as they worked to develop the tools and techniques and practices that have become part of this big White House spin machine. Give you a couple names. One sort of amazing forgotten figure, Emil Hurja, who is this Finnish geologist who becomes FDR's pollster, the first White House pollster.
Yeah.
He was kind of a political buff, and he had learned about statistics by kind of working in ore and iron and extractive industries, and realizes that the way they were testing public opinion was wrong, that you have to, just like with a piece of rock, you have to pulverize the whole thing. You can't just skim the surface. So with public opinion, you have to take a real cross-section. And it was a real contribution to polling and so on. We did an
Except
excerpt.
he got Dewey wrong.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, everyone got Dewey wrong, but one excerpt in Politico called him FDR's Nate Silver because he was doing that. So there's the story of these spin doctors. And then the third story is of these critics and intellectuals, people like Vance Packard, Hannah Arendt, who sort of take it as their mission to figure out what this new emerging world of spin is all about. And they're there also from the very beginning, from an early sociologist named Edward Ross I write about, up through people like Stephen Colbert, who's also in the book. And these critics, some of them are kind of Platonists. They see this spin as ruining democracy. Others are real boosters who see the advent, John Dewey, different Dewey, sees radio, for example, as a great democratic opportunity because it can, he hopes turn this mass society into a kind of town hall again.
Was he the one who pointed out that Calvin Coolidge's voice, he may have been after Coolidge, but Calvin Coolidge's voice was heard by 10 times as many people as any other man who ever lived?
Yeah.
And when you think about how technology was intersecting with this, you think, well, why wouldn't they take advantage of it? I mean, what a leap that was.
Right. So, this is part of the story is these technological innovations and how presidents, along with these spin doctors, kind of learn to exploit them. And there's always sort of a period of fumbling around before they get it right. So Coolidge, who thinks of himself as not a great kind of old-fashioned orator like William Jennings Bryan or even like Theodore Roosevelt, who was kind of idiosyncratic in his speaking style, but certainly captivated people, from the rostrum. But Coolidge has a more soft-spoken style, and yet he finds it's very effective on radio. And so he starts giving his inaugural address, broadcasting that around the nation, his acceptance address when he accepts the Republican nomination in 1924. But this is a step forward, but then it's really Franklin Roosevelt who realizes he can write speeches for radio that are of a totally different character from the kind of speech he would give and sort of just put a microphone in front of him. And so that's where we get the fireside chats, that these are done with the explicit intent that they're meant to be short, they're meant to be used selectively, and I found all kinds of fascinating details about the preparations. He would have his nostrils swabbed for tonal clarity before these speeches. So, Roosevelt is trying to convey, as Coolidge had, a sense of intimacy, and people felt that. People would put pictures of FDR on their radios because they identified the radio with him. And yet,
I have to say, I love the little detail when the radio was so new at this time that there were still people who thought there were little people
right.
in the radio.
Yeah.
And that
Talk
when the
back to
radio
them.
said something, you could ask them to say it again.
Right.
Which, I mean, it's just, it's nice to immerse back in that time because we're so assaulted right now.
Right, exactly. And what's interesting about, the story of whether it's FDR's preparations or the preparations that any of them take is we think of FDR as such a natural. And of course he was in a sense, or Theodore Roosevelt for that matter. But that naturalness also was the result of preparation and practice and discipline. And these days when we talk about authenticity in politics, it's important to keep in mind that those former presidents, back in the day who we think of as so authentic, they too worked on their image. It doesn't mean they were insincere or that they were phony. I mean, that's an important thing to keep in mind. But it was studied, it was crafted, it was put together with deliberate intent.
Well, but how do we know? I'm going to get to questions about more modern day.
Right.
How do we know who really was what we thought they were? So who wrote their own speeches, even if maybe they hired somebody to help them? Truman, I think somebody told him when to pause so that he could speak more effectively.
Right.
How do we know who was the real deal?
Right. Well, in politics, the real self is arguably the self who the public gets to know. I think it's kind of a myth or a fiction that we tell ourselves that the person, in private, how they are with their spouse or with their children, is more real than the public self. The sociologist Irving Goffman had this idea of front stage and backstage selves, and Paul Begala, one of Bill Clinton's spin doctors, said, Bill Clinton was the person in political life he saw where there was the smallest gap between the backstage and the front stage, and that's why he felt Clinton came across as authentic. Now that's sort of one way of looking at it, but I think all of us are one way, when we're with our parents, one way when we're with our wives or spouses, one way when we're on stage in front of a crowd. We have different personas, and that's part of politics. And having a persona of how you act in a debate or on a stage doesn't make you a phony. It means you have a sense of political performance.
But you'd like to think that Lincoln wrote what he said. But
Well,
when did they stop writing what they said?
So, Lincoln did write his speeches, but he also got help from his cabinet, William Seward and others. He would, get input and contributions. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton assisted him with his speeches too. But yes, Woodrow Wilson kept a typewriter at his desk and very much, wrote his speeches.
14 points, yeah.
That does start to change with Wilson's successor, Warren Harding, who hires the first White House speechwriter. The official title of White House speechwriter doesn't come until the Eisenhower years. But Harding has a literary clerk, a former journalist named Judson Welliver. And Welliver is brought on for two reasons. One, as the president becomes more of this public figure, and I use the term the public presidency to sort of suggest a president whose whole operation is geared toward the public as opposed to just being the executive behind the scenes. So the public's demand to see and hear the president is escalating a lot in the 20s. So Harding just needs help in producing these statements. But Harding has also got a reputation as kind of a classic windbag. He's a bloviator. In fact, I think the term bloviate was coined to refer to Harding. And H.L. Mencken, another figure from the 1920s, has this famous description of a Harding speech where he compares it to stale bean soup and dogs barking at the line. And there's just something about his speech. So Welliver comes in, and he's good with the pen, and even Mencken says, yeah, I think we can see old Welliver's hand in some of these speeches. It seems to be helping. Yeah. Thereafter, there's kind of no turning back. And that's another theme of the book, is once a certain innovation or insight or practice is established and is seen as effective, it becomes very hard for the next president or successive presidents to ignore it. And that's one reason the spin machine kind of grows and metastasizes.
But then comes World War II, and Americans get to see what real propaganda is. Talk about that. Talk about the sort of pullback and the fear of going in the direction that the Nazis perfected.
Mm-hmm. So after World War I, because of the disillusionment with the war and with the failure to secure the League of Nations and a sense of America turning away from global engagement, there's also a big backlash and suspicion of propaganda, of the Committee on Public Information that I had mentioned, and there's a whole cottage industry of books about how terrible propaganda is. Well, when we get to the 30s, when we start to see what Goebbels is doing and Hitler is doing in Germany, American propaganda starts to seem kind of rather benign in contrast. I mean, it's an interesting fact that Roosevelt gives his first fireside chat just a few days apart from when Hitler names Goebbels Minister of Propaganda and Popular Enlightenment, which was his title. So these things are kind of parallel phenomena. And Americans who once kind of deplored all government propaganda in the US start to see, well, again, a more Aristotelian position. It can be good or it can be bad. Roosevelt's messages to us, aren't the same thing as a totalitarian society abroad where the public doesn't have recourse to counterspin to other messages. And so so I call it the age of communication, where people start seeing this as a way for the public to talk to the president and the president to talk to the public, and it becomes seen as somewhat less fearsome. Then in the Cold War, with Vance-Packard, we start to get the new fears all over again.
Yeah, and by the way, it was largely the feeling was the public needed to be educated.
Right.
How could they make decisions? How could citizenry participate in a democracy if they didn't know? Whereas now we have so many ways of learning things, but they really felt they needed to educate, which sounds a little paternalistic, but...
Well, and it is a little paternalistic, but this was sort of part of even the progressive vision of people like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, that they thought public opinion shouldn't be just kind of this mass sentiment, and that democracy shouldn't be just about listening to kind of the raw primal urges of the collective public, but those sentiments should be voiced, and then it should fall to leaders to listen, to distill, to make sense of it, and then, as Wilson said, to interpret it, to read then back, to give speeches and so on, to tell the public, this is what I take public opinion to be, as a way of getting the public's blessing. And again, to sort of jump to our own time, I think some of us might, in the wake of what's happening in politics today, see some virtues in institutions, in wise leaders who act as a kind of restraining force on just mass public sentiment.
Yeah, well, we will get to that, but before we do, I just want to talk about some other figures that jump out. Walter Lippmann, what was his role? Edward Bernays, these people crossed from one field, journalism or advertising, over into spin and back.
So many of these figures, and more than we can cover here. Lippmann is, I think, an especially important figure for a number of reasons. As a very young man, he's kind of active in the scene, and in Washington, he goes to work for the Wilson administration in public information and he believes it. He has this vision that wise, kind of informed public leadership can sort of tutor and educate public opinion. Now, for this reason, Lippmann is sometimes today by historians looked as this elitist figure who was kind of anti-democratic, and that's really a misreading. People talk about Lippmann being in debate with John Dewey, but I went back and looked at this. Lippmann and John Dewey actually had a lot in common. Both were committed Democrats. The one that Lippmann was really in debate with was H.L. Mencken, who is often remembered fondly because he had this sort of hilarious coruscating writing style and, poked fun at all these, shibboleths, these conservatives, Rotarians, so on. But he was a real anti-democrat. I mean,
he reminded me of Rush Limbaugh, just in the way that he commented on people.
I mean, there's this wonderful political science blog called The Monkey Cage, which takes its name from a Mencken quote about democracy is sort of, I forget exactly how it looks, but he basically sort of compares democracy to a zoo, to the monkey cage. Well, that's a pretty contemptuous view of democracy. And compared to those like Mencken, who in the 20s were really ready to practically abandon democracy. And a lot of the world was turning toward dictatorship at that point. You look at Italy and so on. And so for Lippmann, the alternative was, a prudent, or John Dewey calls it, a prudent and temperate democracy. Not the William Jennings Bryan vision of just this upwelling of the masses, but a democracy that was educated, that was informed, that was guided by wise leaders and experts. And that was really in sharp contrast to a view of Mencken and the conservatives.
But didn't Lippmann also start to really worry about the role of publicity and PR in the government?
Right. So I mean, Lippmann is sort of constantly sort of fretting about this problem, and yet he remains America's leading commentator or pundit, which was a label applied to him even I think back in the 20s, trying to sort of fulfill this role himself. That compared to just sort of the mass publicity of tabloid headlines and so on, that there's a place for the informed columnist who can sort of give people a chance for reflection, to make more informed political choices. And he really saw that as his own role. And so he returns in my story. A lot of these characters appear in one period in the teens or the 20s, but then they return in the book in the 50s, or if they live long enough, Lippmann into the Vietnam War era. And even then in Vietnam, Lippmann is kind of warring with Lyndon Johnson. He's anti-Vietnam War, and he's trying to sort of, again, exercise that sort of sage, reasonable argument against Johnson, who's building up this big publicity machine to try to sell the Vietnam War.
As you get to the Vietnam War, the book seems to accelerate as our public relations machines really gear up. I mean, I'm turning the page faster, but it also feels like you're more efficiently putting us through these eras because it's just going at warp speed, how things are changing. You have Lyndon Johnson calling up CBS President Frank Stanton the day after Morley Safer is on the news, showing films of Marines casually torching villages, and the phrase, burn the village to save it. And this is Johnson to Stanton on the phone the next morning. Frank, you trying to F me? I mean, this is your president, and yesterday your boys shat on the American flag. I mean, now we see television intersecting with the White House, the Vietnam War, Watergate, Richard Nixon. Stay for a second on Richard Nixon, because we knew about the phrase tricky dick. We knew how he was more and more embattled. I had no idea how much he was trying to, and we knew we knew the cover-up. We knew Johnson's cover-up of the war, the Gulf of Tonkin incident that didn't happen. But talk about Nixon and his feeling about image, because I think you quote him as saying that concern for image must rank with concern for substance. He wrote that in his autobiography.
Right, exactly. I mean, Nixon, I wrote a previous book about Nixon called Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image. And in a way, it was writing that book that led me to write this one. But I think Nixon is really a critical figure in sort of the rise of modern spin. That you could say it's with Nixon that the White House is kind of put on a full-time, spin footing, which is not to say that he wasn't also concerned with substance. He was serious about some of the policies he pursued, especially foreign policy. But with every policy initiative that's launched, there are these, you can go into the Nixon archives, these enormous game plans, these thick memos of who exactly is going to talk to which columnist and which PR strategies are going to be utilized. The degree of polling is just leaps. I mean, Kennedy used polling, LBJ used polling, but with Nixon, there's a quantum leap. The sense that it has to be a kind of full-time concern of how each day, each week is going to play in the media, really, which is still the case, really sort of, I think, becomes the norm with Nixon. And in some ways, that goes to the heart of who Nixon is, because Nixon, again, this is what I wrote in my first book. You look through the literature on Nixon, and there's this trope of who is the real Nixon, that there's a sense of a man behind a mask. And so that question of authenticity and of reinvention and using the mass media, can Nixon portray himself any which way he likes? That becomes kind of this abiding anxiety we have about Nixon, but also about many subsequent presidents.
Well, but it drove him to distraction.
Right.
I've got to, again, fast forward. We want to be able to get some of your questions in. And there's just so many levels to this, but I'll just move through another era. Post-Watergate, it stripped a lot of people's belief in government on the left, but on the right, it stripped faith in the press. So you have these dueling, you have the rise of Rush Limbaugh, Roger Ailes, trying to create their own media. But you point out that George Lakoff, the linguist, who was, studied at the knee of Noam Chomsky, was watching what was going on the right and thought, what? Well, maybe I can also study words to see how they can convey ideas?
Right. And so when a lot of people hear the word spin, this is one of the first things we think of. I mean, we think of spin as the broad phenomenon of image making and message craft, but there's also that kind of fine-tuning of language, which of course has been going on for a long time. In the 1920s, the American Bankers Association renamed itself the American Taxpayers Association, or this kind of thing. It goes back. But in the 1980s and 90s, the Republicans, and in particular Frank Luntz, the pollster, became very focused on small choices of language and recasting particular policies with new names, repeating certain words and phrases, and having very strong message discipline. And with Newt Gingrich in 1994, this was one of the strategies for taking back the House of Representatives. And some of these things like the estate tax being renamed the death tax, which obviously is a more ominous prospect. And Lakoff, who's he's an academic, he's a linguist, but who pays attention to politics. And so again, he's one of the intellectuals, critics, but who also then becomes something of a spin doctor himself. He sees the same can be done on the Democratic side, and he wants to kind of get underneath the language. Well, what are the values that the two different parties convey? For him, the Republicans are conveying a sense of the strong, disciplinary father, and the Democrats have to play up their image or find language that speaks to their image as the nurturant parent. It's interesting he doesn't say mother. That would be perhaps too feminized. But then a funny thing happens. Lakoff becomes kind of this cult figure. He's invited to these Democratic study groups. The Kerry campaign has him in. But he finds that people just want him to kind of offer up the magic words. Okay, what do we need to call this in order to win? As if it's some kind of science or some kind of trick. And this is a popular misperception about spin that, I trace throughout the book. In the 1930s, the first political consulting firm called Whitaker and Baxter that I write about, they're presumed to have like these magic secrets, when actually they're just a very disciplined professional firm. And Lakoff is kind of baffled, and he realizes that, people they're not really interested in his theories. They just want some quick fix that will help the Democrats win instead of the Republicans.
They want the magic words, but what he wanted was to find the words that would convey the ideas that he believed strongly in. And they didn't care about the ideas anymore. It's just, what are the words that will win?
Exactly. And another thing that I found that's a motif of the book. The most effective spin, and every expert in the book pretty much comes to this conclusion, whether it's Bernays or Goebbels or Lakoff, the most effective spin is not spin that lies, but spin that expresses a truth. That spin is effective when it succinctly and powerfully expresses the underlying ideas. And if you're trying to sort of just cover something up or point people in the wrong direction, well, you might get away with it in the short term, but that's not going to be kind of the lasting spin that really moves the public.
Well, it becomes a blur as we, again, fast forward. You've got Jimmy Carter, Jerry Rafshoon, Ronald Reagan's Michael Deaver, we mentioned, Morning in America. Poor Mike Dukakis in a helmet or throwing a baseball,
Right.
being, a reporter watching him try to throw a baseball. Bush's mission accomplice, David Axelrod, and President Obama. But just how would you characterize the last 20 years or so when it comes to spin?
Right. Well, I think in some ways we think of this as like the heyday of spin, but what they're doing now is not so much inventing new techniques or new methods. A lot of the machinery has been in place since, say, the Nixon years and the Johnson years. That, in some ways, what we're doing now has just been sort of fine-tuning. But I think what's really significant about the recent period and why it feels so overwhelming is the number of media outlets has proliferated so much. We have partisan media and social media, which are sort of dedicated to, these are sort of, these are not the channels where we're used to hearing it from. We're used to counting on the media to sort of set us straight, although of course we know that they do have their own biases and opinions. But now that's changed. So now you're getting on the television this bombardment of spin from various surrogates, various advocates.
Even when they call it the no spin room.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's saying something when the no spin zone is hosted by the most, provocative, controversial, opinionated host in Bill O'Reilly. So what we have is kind of this sort of overwhelming surfeit of spin, and people, I think, find it harder to find an anchor where they can orient themselves around the swirl of information. Time was you could go to certain news media outlets, whether it was the major newspapers, the major news weeklies, the nightly news broadcasts. Again, they might have their biases or their blind spots, but they provided a kind of sense of orientation. And I think there's less of a sense now that people know where to turn.
Well, I was wondering, when all is said and done, and I was reading this book while watching primary results and town hall meetings and doing both simultaneously. Do you think we're seeing in this particular election season a sort of mutually assured destruction that, the seeds were planted back in Teddy Roosevelt's time, because it's just gotten so hardened, so out of control, that you have members of the electorate on both sides who don't believe a thing they hear? I mean, you have the Trump followers on one side and you have Bernie Sanders on the other, and then everybody else scattered throughout,
Right.
The other campaigns, but people who absolutely say, we don't believe government.
Right. Well, I mean, the suspicion of government and the suspicion even of the press, does go back a ways, and there have been lots of other periods in our history where it's been quite pronounced. What I think is different this year is the extent to which, partly enabled by partisan media, but also partly just the media has kind of surrendered to the theater of it all in a way that it typically hasn't. And so there's a sense, especially with Trump, I think, that they don't quite know how to handle him. And he does have, like Theodore Roosevelt and like some of the other presidents I discussed, a very good intuitive feel of how to play the media. And he can, so the day after he comes in second in Iowa, and everybody for the first time is talking about a different candidate in Ted Cruz, is when he chooses to make an issue of Ted Cruz's citizenship. Or he says, maybe that was the day he said he was going to sue Ted Cruz about for fraud, for whatever, for election cheating, and the remark about Ben Carson or something like that. He had a good instinct of how to get the spotlight back onto him, and because he's not coming out of the political system, he's kind of confounded the press this year.
Well, how does Donald Trump intersect with what you've learned about spin? Because he does seem to have his own personal inner mechanism, spin mechanism, but I don't feel I see all the trappings that you described for the other presidents past or candidates past. And it's almost like it's not as if he's hiring the speechwriter that we know or hiring the polling firms. It feels like it's all contained in one person.
Right. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, what is, I think, appealing to some people about Trump and also about Sanders is this so-called authenticity. And I say so-called because I think it's artificial. For Trump, there's no question that he is often unfiltered, unvarnished. He's quick to say what's on his mind. And that is appealing. His declaration, I don't go for political correctness, I won't mince words, all of that true, very much Trump. But that shouldn't obscure the fact that there is a method in his madness. There's been some reporting recently about just how deliberate this campaign was. There's been some good stories for the first time, some kind of stories that have done some digging rather than just kind of arguing about whether what he said was sexist or racist or not, but actually digging. Okay, he's been planning this. He's had a strategy for how to do this going back many months. He has worked with consultants, people like Roger Stone, who is a big Republican consultant going back to the Nixon era. He may not have speechwriters in the same way, but he's very deliberate in how he plans out what he's going to say at each given press conference or post-victory speech. And same with Sanders. Sanders, it sort of seems like this guy, he kind of like rolls out of bed and gives a speech like he could still be in his like nightgown and nightcap and kind of, but he's really worked closely with Tad Devine, who's one of like the top drawer Democratic consultants. The day after the New Hampshire primary, a New York Times reporter stated in his own words Bernie Sanders' line, "The system is rigged." But in the voice of this New York Times reporter. This was a line that I had attended a White House gathering for the State of the Union, where different academics and consultants were being asked to kind of brainstorm ideas. Tad Devine was there telling the White House staff that Obama, in his last year's State of the Union, should make the argument, the system is rigged. And he gave the whole Bernie Sanders spiel. And some of the other people in the room were like, oh, you're working for Sanders, that's going to be his campaign. So this is, I don't doubt that Sanders believes this, but this is every bit as methodically planned and calculated as anything that any other candidate says.
But has something happened this time around? And we're going to open it up for questions just right after this. But has something happened? I was watching last night after the, Florida and Ohio. And you hear Hillary Clinton came out and gave kind of her stump speech. I was on the road several times, and every time I'd see her come out, she just barely won in some areas, right. And everybody's just going crazy. And she'd come out, and I've met her. She's very warm in person, and I wanted her to say, shoo, that was close.
Right.
And thank you so much, the way any of us would. And she came out and said, thank you. I'm going to build a ladder. And I thought to myself, was that the first thing I'd say to a person? After I'm going to build a ladder, but that she was sticking with the talking points. Last night you heard her make her thank you speech after winning. It was ringing, and it was up here in the way the speeches are. You heard Kasich make his. You heard Rubio make his. Bowing out is very. It rang in that way that we're used to hearing. And then Donald Trump comes out and he says, I saw a guy and he was on the grass, and I said, don't look at the TV. There's an ad on, and look at the grass.
Right.
It was so jarring that it was not at all like the three previous speakers had been. And it really hits you when you see it like that it is different. Are people running back to the drawing boards? Are people saying, wait a minute, we got to rip everything up because we can't send you out with talking points anymore because it's become so obvious?
Yes, I mean, this is something that I think Trump understands very well, that the impatience, the exasperation, the exhaustion with the scripted speech, with the focus group tested talking points, has become visible to all of us, and we lose patience with it, even sometimes when it is our own side, when it is our own candidate. But again, it's not entirely new. One story from the book going back to the 1940s. In 1948, Harry Truman, accepting the Democratic Party nomination, gave this speech which was not from a complete typescript, but was from notes, and he got these rave reviews on his new spontaneous, extemporaneous style. And Truman, who had, for those of you who know this, not been seen as like a strong candidate for re-election, or really for election for the first time in his own right, kind of suddenly seemed to be getting a new lift. Well, it turned out that months before, his aides he had diagnosed that he had a real problem giving speeches. He had gone into the broadcast studio with a man named Leonard Reinsch, who is the Democrats' radio coach, and he worked on his pacing. They deliberately came up with this new ad-lib style that they thought would be more effective. Now, Harry Truman was still very much a salt-of-the-earth guy. He still, could be spontaneous and tell a theater critic who badly reviewed his daughter's performance, he wanted to punch him in the nose. So there was that side of Truman. Yeah, right, exactly. So there was that side of Truman for sure, but it was also practiced. And so I think probably the same is here with Trump. Trump knows full well what he's doing. He doesn't go out there without a clue as to what he'll say and just makes it up. He's got it planned out, and maybe he, thought of it that afternoon, or the bit with the stakes and the stuff. Maybe that was something that just he threw in there, and he can make errors too when he does that. But right, yeah, among. I love that they were Bush Brothers stakes. Oh, is that right? Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, it was also just bizarre. I mean, but. Yeah, I think, Trump gets this, and that other candidates are, have to find other ways. But the notion that one is more true or authentic is, I think, the mistake. It's just this is Trump's way of communicating. That's effective for his message, for his persona.
But you don't think it's changing everything? It throws this whole book out.
Well. When Marco Rubio tried to do it, it didn't work so well for him. There still is going to be a tension between spontaneity and message discipline. That those things are kind of inherently in tension, and we want them both. So we have had many candidates who seem to be riding high because they said what was on their mind and they didn't mince words, they shot from the hip, only to make some horrendous gaffe that caused them all kinds of problems. Now, we could say, well, that, Trump's been immune to that. Well, maybe he has or maybe he hasn't. Maybe this will get him the Republican nomination, but not much more than that. I mean, we don't know how this movie ends yet. And it's something you learn as a historian, that when you're in the moment, you sort of have to suspend some judgment, because we're all kind of caught up in the zeitgeist and responding to the same stimuli, but we're prisoners of this very moment. And in 6 months from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, then we'll have a different kind of perspective to see how Trump fits in.
Well, again, David Greenberg, just a terrific book in this jewel of an institution here in Boston, the Massachusetts Historical Society. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin.